Today's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, where we are celebrating the new year in style. For this week, until Sunday, January the 16th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, we have hundreds of singles discounted to exactly $20.22. And normally, this is where I would go to the page at StarCityGames.com/sale, I'd sort by price, and just read off some of the items there. That's not going to work this time around for obvious reasons, but rest assured, there is a lot of cool stuff there up for grabs all this week over, once again, at StarCityGames.com/sale.
This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Chalice Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit chaliceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snap Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want a splash of a commander deck? Check out the Keep in 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 39 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly, or mostly weekly. We took last week off, holiday season and all that, new year, but we're back. A weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with Ari Lax, and today we're here to talk about more of the same. It feels like nothing has really happened since we last came in here, but in true advanced podcasting fashion, we're going to spin that into our topic and try and get into why that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for a lack of trying. People certainly have come up with some crazy stuff in the last couple of weeks and played it, but I think that Modern is really settling into what it's going to look like in, I don't want to say long term. I don't want to trust anything to be the long term at this point, but like the medium plus term.
Yeah, my article from last week was going over the whole year of 2021 as it pertains to Modern, and there were some real twists and turns along the way there, both. And I think it's fair to divide it into the pre-MH2 phase of that year and the post-MH2 phase. And both of those really saw significant upheavals throughout. So I would not take anything for granted. I would not assume that how the format looks right now is how it's going to look in, 6 months' time. But I do think we are reaching maybe the natural endpoint of this iteration of the format. And it's worth maybe taking a look at how we got there and where things might go from here.
Yeah, I mean, these challenges should lay out most of the decks, but we do see a fairly reliable crew of things winning. Though, again, we're talking about this. One of the current best decks in the format wasn't even that popular a month and a half ago, right?
Right. And I think when the history of that deck eventually gets written, it's going to be interesting to see when exactly it first popped up and that transition from, oh yeah, this is the deck I've seen before. I'm sure Aspiring Spike 5-0'd a league on stream with this. And, a few people who maybe were ahead of the curve for picking this up and taking it seriously to, oh wait, this is just maybe the default best deck that is everywhere in every tournament now.
Yeah, it is. Grixis Shadow is a weird one, and it has put up at least one more challenge win since we last met up. So I guess let's just jump into what we saw. And you want to work forward or backwards in time? So 2 weeks ago or last weekend?
I guess we'll quickly cover the results from last weekend, because if anything, those might be the more interesting ones here.
Yeah. So wait, this is always a constant topic of debate. We're talking about last weekend as in the one that happened.
Oh, God.
Yes. So the one from the one that was at least 7 days ago. The
penultimate set of results that we have to look at here.
There we go. Yes. And Soul Strong has won yet again in not another repost. This was the Sunday challenge of that week.
New year, same old Soul Strong as it happens. No signs of slowing down here.
Yeah, not much has changed in the Shadow list. It's just doing Shadow stuff, still Toraking people out of the sideboard. We do see a Living End resurgence in this top 8. And then the fun begins. We have the Underworld Breach deck, which is kind of like almost just another version of one of the fair red decks with Ragavan and Dragon Rage Channeler that's been bouncing around. And it's got the Grinding Station Mox Amber loop with Emery to set up with Breach, and that's the actual win condition. But it's really just a lot of good cards with a Breach combo.
Yeah, this feels like the classic recipe of one of those broken decks where you take a powerful combo shell that has a lot of potential and just graft all of the generically good cards onto it and get this amazing backup planet in the process. You get to be an Urza Saga deck, an Expressive Iteration deck. You have all of this great stuff. In my experience, it just doesn't really come together all that consistently. And you end up with, and this is the risk that you take with doing that, you end up with a combo deck that's not a great combo deck, and then a mid-range deck that sometimes just draws a grinding station when it would really rather draw any other piece of cardboard. So if you can find a way to square that circle consistently, then yeah, I would definitely take another look at this deck. But in its current incarnation, I'm not as convinced as I would dearly love to be.
Yeah, I think that's something that has happened over between Modern Horizons 2 and the London Mull. It's really kind of the whole splitting the difference is not as important because you play mostly like optimized games. So like playing a combo deck that has a much more reliably optimized hand is better, and like playing a control deck that has better cards and just like doesn't have to like part of the edge of the old combo control decks is like you would play the head to head against the control deck on their controlled cards, but also force them to have cards to beat your combo. And like they were just always on the back foot of like, well, I need to have Terminate in my deck for your Splinter Twin, but like that card would just be terrible in the matchup otherwise. Whereas like now it's just like, yeah, okay, so I'm just gonna Prismatic Ending one of your things and counterspell your thing, and it's really at no cost to me. And now you can draw 2 grinding stations, and that is bad for you.
Yeah, it seems much easier nowadays to be either a full-on combo deck, although that runs into some of the structural issues in the format that we spoke about, must have been months ago now, or you can be a dedicated mid-range deck. But if you're doing that in these colors, then we already have templates for how that looks. You can play Izzet Murktide, you can play Grixis Shadow. You don't need to be this watered-down version of one of those. And again, sometimes you're drawing these random combo pieces that don't really do anything otherwise, and it all gets kind of messy from there. In a way, you could argue that this is the tension that a lot of these hammer builds are facing at the moment, is how much do you lean into the pure, make my thing big and bonk you side of that equation versus hedging in such a way that you can play this more kind of like mid-rangey creature game. And we've seen lots of different hammer lists in these results, actually, and they fall on different sides of that divide.
Yeah, I think that this list, and one of the reasons I think this deck sees the most success of these hybrid control decks, or some of the most success, is that Urza Saga is so good at doing the fair side of things that it is one of the few cards that can make up for those like Grinding Station, Mox Amber, nothing hands. It's just like, okay, well, I'm just going to Urza Saga and make some constructs and battle you with them. So I do like this deck on that angle, and I think Hammer gets to do that. And I also think the 4th place deck from this challenge is leaning into the same thing, and that's a Yorion Urza Azorius, the Thopter Foundry, Sword of the Meek Urza kind of stuff that we've seen floating around. This list, moving on to the 4th place list, does have a higher number of counterspells than we typically see, and I like that. Literal counterspell alongside Metallic Rebuke. And I think that one of the ways to, as you said, square that circle is making your combo components good cards to draw. So like Urza is a good card to draw. Thopter Foundry, a bit less so, but not horrific.
Yeah, and Sword of the Meek, you really don't want to draw that one, but it's a one-of in an 80-card deck here. You can find that one up with your Stoneforge Mystic and your Worm of Invention. So you're not going to get those natural-ish, Thopter Foundry into Sword into Urza curves that you kind of had during the initial months of Urza's time in Modern, but you can delay the game to the point where you get 2 out of the 3, and then finding the last one is fairly simple from there.
Yeah, and I think that this deck, it's sort of like this. I don't like War of Invention as a card too much, but I think that you can lean into it in a similar fashion the way the Eladamari's Call 4-color decks lean into that card. It's a different scale because you're finding like when you call for Solitude, it's just way more efficient than when you like were for a Portable Hole, but it's attempting to do the same thing at least.
Yeah, there is an interesting fork in the road here where I think if I were to revisit this deck, I would want to load up on as many Prismatic Endings plus Portable Holes as possible. And when I took this deck to the challenge a few months ago, Portable Hole was the reason why. I was thinking, well, okay, now you have this good imitation of Prismatic Ending, which you can find with Worm of Invention, which taps some mana with Urza. It just kind of meshes neatly with everything you're doing. This deck only has one Portable Hole as that tutor target, and I think a large part of that is it doesn't want this tension or overlap with Chalice of the Void, which we see in the main deck as a 4 of here. And that's the thing you would have taken for granted months ago when the Cascade decks, both of them, were the talk of the town. Right now, it seems like if you're putting Chalice in your deck, it's mainly because you plan to set it on X=1 against Grixis Shadow or Hammer for the most part, and once you're doing that, you don't want your main removal against those decks to run into that later on.
Yeah, I like that here a little more than in some of the control decks, because I think this deck is already taking the position of going big in the control mirrors, and like it can sacrifice that ground, whereas against the Shadow and Hammer decks, it is sort of losing ground by being a little more weird around the edges. Whereas like the 4-color deck can just kind of like raw card quality its way through those matchups, and like, you know, Omnath solves a lot of problems. This deck, Urza, as good as Urza is, it is not Omnath. I'll just say that right here.
Yeah, despite being maybe one of the flagship cards from the first Modern Horizons, the headline act in several best decks, including just an obscenely good ban-worthy deck, it feels quite anemic by the standards of current Modern. We've mentioned this issue of just any card that costs more than 3 or even 2 mana has to clear this incredibly high bar, and Urza just about does that, but it's kind of dicey. You can imagine it like crashing into the bar and then everything falls apart.
Yeah, I think that some of that is that it just entices you to play a lot of bad cards, and this deck has tried to trim down on that a decent amount. So maybe we're getting somewhere, but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I will say I do like this approach more than the list that we saw a while back that had a bunch of like Esper Sentinels and Ingenious Smiths and this more creature-heavy battlefield focus. I found with those lists, you were being stretched in so many different directions that, you know, you weren't really doing anything, and your opponent very quickly reached the point where they could just cast a spell and pay for your Esper Sentinel, or, you know, you had a 4/4 Ingenious Smith, but that wasn't backed up by anything, and so where was that getting you? I think this deck kind of knows what its lane is and tries to stay in there a little bit more.
Yeah, I liked Sentinel, but like very, very specifically as a card you would cast against an opponent who's trying to lead on Ragavan, just because like the lineups there are really awkward for them, where like a lot of the advantage there is in the mana that they lose when they're trying to play through an Esper Sentinel, and like it also blocks Ragavan. It's just like you can only play 4 Portable Hole, and I was kind of liking it as additional copies, but I'm also fine just not having it in the deck.
Yeah, so that was last week. This week we see one of the same names popping up, actually, and that's Moksha, who has been doing consistently well with, I think the way it's labeled here is just 4-color control with Yorion. And so if you think back a few months ago, there was this divide between the Yorion versions of the 4-color decks, and some of those leaned further or less into this Ephemerate package. And then the 60-card list, which had Kahira instead, had this more controlling focus. And so depending on which avenue you wanted to go down, that determined how many cards you put in your deck, and then your companion, and so on and so forth. Moksha seems to be splitting the difference almost. This is retaining a lot of the more reactive focus there. None of the Ephemerate stuff, a lot more stuff that plays instant speed, but then also just the Abundant Growth, Spreading Seas, Yorion endgame there too.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. I do like that it's borrowing Memory Deluge to kind of go over the top in these control mirrors. Not that like a deck with Yorion needs more things to spend mana on, but it is nice when your opponent is actually interacting on the stack to have just a little extra stuff to go into the long game.
I don't know how deep in the weeds you've been able to get with these 4-color mirrors. Do you have time to be resolving and then flashing back a Memory Deluge? Because in my experience, the games last very long in raw turn count and lots of game actions being taken on both sides and so on. But it feels like everyone is using most of their mana every turn, and it's quite rare that you have just a clear turn with nothing else going on where you can just tap out to not impact the board in any way.
I think that this list is better positioned to do that than the others, just because it's all like, how many counterspells are in the traditional list? Like what? It's like usually like 1 to 2 Dovin's Veto and 1 to 2 Counterspell, and this list is overloading on those on top of that. This reminds me a lot of the Hellish Week of Omnath mirrors in Standard, where you could take the approach of just like, these are my Omnath things, good luck. Or you could take the approach of like, I am playing a bunch of like slow interactive cards in Omnath. And what ended up happening in those mirrors was that the slow, stupid interactive deck would like take 57 minutes off the clock, even though there was only 50 minutes, and target its opponent with Kenrith, 3 times and they'd deck, and it was horrible. But this is like playing to the same space, it feels like.
Much like the Valkyrie era of Modern last year, I find that all very charming in retrospect, given that it only lasted for a fortnight at maximum. I think if it had been any longer than that, then, I don't know if that novelty would have aged too well.
No, it was horrible. It was literally the worst. The Oko one was like, in retrospect, I think I should have enjoyed more. Omnath, I would never go back and play those matches.
Mm-hmm. So the Saturday challenge here, as of last weekend, this most recent weekend, we included Max McVeasy on Boros Praris. So this is the more streamlined version of this deck here with 16 1-drops, a bunch of lightning bolts and lava darts. We have Unholy Heat, so recognizing that the focus isn't just on getting them from 20 to 0 as fast as possible. You can play board control as well between Unholy Heat, Prismatic Ending. You have a lot of flexibility there. And then the 8-pack of Light Up the Stage and Reckless Impulse to keep the cards and the Praris triggers flowing in the mid-game there.
Yeah, this is a deck that had been picking up a little bit, but then really got a lot of steam with the printing of Reckless Impulse. How much of this do you think is Max just being like very good with monocolored aggro, and how much of it do you think is this deck being like well positioned in some specific way?
It's a little bit of both, I think. We saw a few other people succeeding with the shell, and even in the earlier, I would say worse and clunkier incarnation with a bunch of like 3-drops and Obosh and so on, that deck still was putting up some results. I think this very streamlined approach makes a lot of sense and does allow you to maybe get underneath some of the 4-color decks if they're distracted by the mirror arms race, or you have you have enough cheap removal that you can survive all but the fastest hammer draws, I think. So even though the tagline from this time last year of, well, hey, Lava Dart's really good right now, so let's find the best Lava Dart deck, that's not really where we are right now. I think this is just a good way to, or another good way to use all of the generically good cards.
Yeah, I will note the sideboard here looks really good. Just like the burn decks have to not play these cards in some fashion, because like often drawing, say, an Alpine Moon is a bad thing, because if you drew a Lightning Bolt, your hand would just win the game instead. Whereas this deck gets to like actually play, Alpine Moons and Path to Exiles and really leverage them. So I think that's actually like a secret big draw to this deck.
Yeah, I wonder if Path to Exile is poised for a little bit of a return, where that is one of your better sideboard cards against both Hammer and not so much is it Motad anymore, but still against Grixis Shadow, which has taken up a lot of that deck's metagame share. Just being able to swat a Death Shadow out of the way, and if that card was a problem in the first place, then they're probably within finishing range at the very least, and that can let you get across that finish line.
Well, let's talk about, to kind of mix and match our challenges. On Sunday, I think someone is taking a similar cue, and this is the 4-color shadow list from a few weeks ago that I want to say was buried in the top 8, but coming in top 4 here in the hands of Il Tedesco. And this, I think some of the aspects of Path, like you have enough instant speed removal, but like the white removal and mirrors really mitigating your opponent's Lurises, in the sense that like you could probably keep them off of having a like threat Luris in a lot of spots. And like, I think that that's really important in these mirrors where they come down to attrition, is like, if you just get to steal the opportunity for them to Luris, it really changes the dynamic of the game. Just because you have Ending and Kaya's Guile in the main deck here. So I think that maybe Path in some situations, but there's a lot of cards trying to do the same thing that could fit into other shells.
Yeah, we saw some of the more controlling Grixis lists that didn't have Death Shadow, had a mix of other threats or just more interaction instead. And it feels like if you're going down that route, this feels like a natural evolution of that, where, yeah, your mana base becomes a fair amount worse, but Prismatic Ending, still one of the premier interactive cards in the entire format, gives you a nice hedge against stuff like Sanctifier on Vec, which would be less of an issue for this deck anyway, but now you have an actual good removal spell that you're happy to have in your deck there. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, Kaya's Guile, another big incentive to be in white. A little bit of a clunky card, but when that card is good, it is absolutely phenomenal. And if we do see, as a response to this more narrow format, people going back to these more linear decks like actual Burn or Dredge or something that's still floating around the orbit of the format, then Kaya's Guile it is kind of nice against at least one of the main decks, and then it's also at its best against just random stuff that you might run into as well.
Yeah, on the flip side of that, moving away from, like, I guess I called this Shadow, but it's just Grixis Pile. I think the loss of the somewhat equivalent Dress Down is actually pretty big if you expect to play against Urza Saga every match. So I think that there's some balancing to be done there.
Yeah, and I don't think you can write off the mana-based concerns as free. So yeah, okay, Raukan Triome does a lot of work, but also sometimes you draw a Raukan Triome in your deck that has this super low curve and wants to be casting as many spells as it can in the early game using all of its mana. So that is not free. That is still a sacrifice, but it's one which I can see why you would want to make.
Yeah, and I guess we've probably got through most of the Saturday Challenge. Sunday Challenge is relatively standard results as well. Noted ringer Dimax winning with the Gingerbrute Core Outfitter version of Hammer, not to be confused with every other version of Hammer that is approximately 50 of the same cards just battling people.
For more on that, see your piece in either last week or the week before at StarCityGames.com.
In the Time Vortex.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I think that we kind of washed over is Murktide is still putting up results somewhere in the top 8. It's like not as reliably as Shadow, but it's still around. I do like the list in this top 8 leaning more on Spell Pierce. I think Flame Blessed Bolt, the sideboard, is cute. I don't really know like how much leverage you get against the lower stacks with that card, but it is cute.
Yeah, worth noting the Murktide pilot there is reigning world champion Yuta Takahashi, so don't know if that's just a player difference contributing to that or what's going on, but yeah, that deck certainly does still have the tools to compete. One of the other Zoomers was in the Saturday top 8 with Murktide as well, so definitely not something that you can count out, and once you move beyond that inner core of Hammer, 4-color, Shadow, I would say Murktide is probably number 4, number 5 on the list of decks you should expect to play against.
Yeah, that's pretty close. It is. It's in a weird spot where like a lot of these high-profile tempo decks tend to cannibalize their own metagame share, as those are the people who feel like they're the most likely to switch week to week. But I think that it's still got enough people, backing Murktide Regent that I would still consider it a threat.
Mm-hmm. Worth noting too, Sanitota, a noted John Saga experimenter whose experiments we've spoken about several times here, in this top 8 with John Saga featuring Elvish Reclaimer in the place of Dragon's Rage Channeler. I don't know if that's a straight swap or if there are other changes you would make to accommodate that card at that point, but Elvish Reclaimer in a fair context. You saw that very occasionally in Legacy, and I'm a little surprised we haven't seen it more in Modern, given that if you can make this into a 1-mana 3/4, that is still a phenomenal rate, even by the very high standards of the MH2 1-drops.
Yeah, I really like that. I think the most heads-up thing involved with it is that you have to cut Dragon Rage Channeler from the deck, not necessarily because it's the worst card, but because if you clump your 1-drops with like Graveyard Hate, you've suddenly created a deck that's like Reclaimer, Tarmogoyf, and Channeler, and if your opponent controls Relic Progenitus, you have a non-functional deck. So I think that's like kind of heads up to not just like pile on the graveyard interactions there. I also really like how Reclaimer in this deck is like, I know that Channeler has some issues with just like how it's strained your red mana, because like if you look at everything else in the deck, you're like just kind of splashing red for removal and Ragavan, and like Channeler really makes it so you need that turn 1 red, but then like with Saga and everything else pulling your mana, it gets a little wonky. And Reclaimer, I think, kind of balances out that a little. But also, like, in the face of Graveyard Hate with Saga, it represents a non-graveyard threat, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, I was already finding the issue with John Saga that my channelers were a little anemic and a little inconsistent. And, if you were already resource light, then in theory, channeler could help get you out of that. But sometimes you were just stuck with this 1/1, which wasn't doing anything in the meantime. And as you say, in the face of actual Graveyard Hate like Relic, that was just a non-starter. Relic can shrink your Elvish Reclaimer, but a Reclaimer can fight back by just fetching up an Urza Saga, which is, a premier threat that doesn't care about the graveyard in any way. And so combine that with the fact that, this Renin 6 Urza Saga endgame, your Reclaimer can help to contribute towards that, and then you now have this extra incentive to play more fetch lands, which also pairs well with Renin 6. So In a way, it's a quite cohesive addition to the deck, and I wonder if that will become a fairly stock uptake going forward.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. I do also like the sideboard extension it provides as like another, just the old Bajuka Bog thing. This is the classic, how does Titan beat Dredge? It beats it every time because it just always hits Bajuka Bog, and that's pretty consistent here. And you have the double whammy of when Bajuka Bog is the best card in your deck, you have Bajuka Bog and Soul Guide Lantern and Urza Saga and Eldritch Reclaimer, so you're just starting the game with 10 Tormod scripts in your deck against Dredge, which is just a great free roll.
Yeah, you mentioned this slight comeback of Living End, and I would imagine this version just kind of has a decent Living End matchup without even trying, because you have these 8 permanents which represent Graveyard Hate and also at least one threat at the same time.
Yeah, I think that matchup in general is a bit tough. The aspect of Urza Saga being a fast Soul Guide Lantern and all the other disruption, it's just a recipe for problems to occur there. I think that this deck pushes it even further, which is important because the Living End deck is really good at exploiting people who think they have enough hate, but are actually a little short. And I don't think this deck ever comes up short on that fact.
Mm-hmm. Anything else from these challenges before we get into our main segment here?
No, maybe just noteworthy that the 2 weirdo decks from the IRL Vegas top 8, the Infect deck that has Phyrexian Crusader and Scales showed up in this top 8 again. Not necessarily the best decks in this format, but they're still, floating around the top tables and certainly on the right power level to compete.
Yeah. How happy would you be to group those into the same umbrella as the Hammer deck in terms of what they're trying to do?
I think that you could say that with Scales. I think the Infect deck is a little more surgically targeting the metagame. It hasn't fundamentally solved any of the problems that Infect has had since Lavadart's printing, which is not necessarily on the back of Lavadart, but it's simultaneously a deck that needs to mulligan a lot and needs to mulligan more because of the rule set, but then also suffers because it needs card density, and it's kind of stuck in this janky halfway point. It just if you play with the deck, you'll just play a league and you'll be yeah, I just didn't play 2 of these 13 games because I didn't have cards in my hand, because my deck is fundamentally flawed. And Amulet did fix that problem. Maybe it can fix that problem, but I think that if you're playing Infect, you have to be very specifically in this window of I want Phyrexian Crusader against these people, and I want to be Infect against these people. These people, the second one of those definitely being a bunch of Canadians. And you're just hoping that you just bowl right down the alley there and don't run into anyone who's I don't know, doing other stuff that is very punishing against Infect.
Mm-hmm. All right, then. We'll take a short break and we'll come back in a second to talk about the 3 actual decks which you can expect to see at the top of Modern, maybe forevermore. Don't go anywhere.
If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than selling to StarCityGames.com. With a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell to anyone else. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell, that's SELL, for details on all 4 of our great ways to turn your cards into cash or credit. Check out our buy list to sell specific cards, ship your cards to us for an offer with our ship and sell program, schedule an appointment with us at Star City Comics and Games in Roanoke, Virginia for the classic experience of selling to a person, or if you are a store or have over 500,000 cards to sell to us, we can come to you. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell for more details on your preferred way to sell your cards, and let us make it the easiest and best experience selling Magic the Gathering cards that you have ever had.
Okay, so let's get into where the format is at the moment. And that seems to be where the format has been for the past few weeks, maybe even the past few months now. And I don't know if this is just what you expect to see after a certain point where any iteration of any format eventually settles into some kind of equilibrium and the best decks get figured out. And maybe it took longer than it would have normally because MH2 was such an earthquake for Modern, and Modern historically, there's, it has such a large card pool and there's so much going on that there's always going to be some churn and some new stuff cropping up from time to time. But is this just, whether it took 2 months or 10 months, eventually the format was going to reach a place like this?
I think that some of it is time, and some of it is also that we ended up with such a variety of decks at the top of the metagame. I know you cited Hammer, Shadow, and 4-color control as the big ones, but like there's also like reasonable arguments to play. We talked about like Scales instead of Hammer, but like also like Shadow or Rakdos or like the various like off branches of those, or Murktide, and then like there's 4-color. And then there's Azorius Control, and then there's also just like weirdo other Yorion decks. I think that the breadth there makes it very like we saw cycling when the metagame was, let's see, when was the stretch from like, I don't know, August to November. We saw a lot of cases where the metagame condensed around like one of these decks or one of their like related archetypes. And then from there, the metagame could easily make a hard turn. But eventually, like the problem is that when you have a varied equilibrium state, it's really hard to like have a good exploit for a specific week, because the like, you're good against this 15% and this 7% and like this 12%, but not this other like 11% and this 5%. Like, and the metagame is not reliably. The other important part is that because it's so spread and the matchups are like actually rotatingly even in a lot of weird ways, you can tend to get this effect of like filtering at the top tables if things skew, and that's like inherently exploitable. And I don't think that's happening right now.
Yeah, when you look at the 3 decks that we've identified there, they seem to represent quite distant and separate poles of the format. So in 4-color, you have the control-ish mid-rangey deck that's a lot of just like generic value pieces, a mostly unbeatable long game if it gets to a certain point. You then have Grixis Shadow, which is the super low curve, like disruptive, aggressive deck, but you also have Lurrus and other ways to fight going long. And then Hammer, which has its own kind of personality conflict between, am I an aggro deck? Am I a combo deck? Am I an aggro combo deck? Exactly where do I fall on that spectrum? But it's clearly within that range somewhere. And so you have Hammer over here, 4-color over here, and then Grixis, somewhere perpendicular off in between. And it feels quite difficult to find an exploit, because these are maybe the best versions of their respective poles, and anything that is hard targeted at one is going to fall victim to at least one of the others. So you can plausibly build a deck that can beat Grixis Shadow at its own game, try and outgrind the 4-color piles. How good is that deck going to be against Hammer, though? Or, you try and go bigger than 4-color with big mana. We saw Tron get second place in one of the challenges this weekend, but then Hammer is faster and more consistent than you are, and certainly for a deck like Tron, that's just a structural issue which you can't really overcome. And so if you expect a metagame with a disproportionate amount of one of these 3 decks, then maybe that factors into what you take instead, and you can find some like actual exploit for that 1 week. But that's not going to lead to any long-term churn, because as that 3-deck metagame writes itself, then you're not actually getting an advantage over just playing one of those 3 decks yourself.
Yeah, and I actually want to like put the positive spin on this in one aspect, is I think that it's possible to beat all 3 of these decks. I think the problem is that it's hard to have like good margin against all 3 of these decks. And that's partly because they represent, like you said, a lot of different things. I think that the important part too is that there's a lot of different like threat and answer balances being represented here. Like the cards that you need to beat Ragavan are different than the cards that you need to beat Urza Saga, but also like the cards that are trying to like, how do you beat Solitude and Fury and Unholy Heat and Thoughtseize at the same time? And I think that like we mentioned the Infect deck being like trying to weave its way through all of this. I think the Infect deck is like fine at weaving its way through all of these specific things. But like I said, it's just an inconsistent deck where like your win percentage cap is lower than it should be in any given matchup that is not like an absolute free roll, the way like an Amulet might be, just because like something's going to go a little wrong and your opponent's just going to have a little bit of a good lineup. And like, as good as Phyrexian Crusader is, when you draw it, you don't always draw it.
Mm-hmm. So one way that metagame can collapse is if that 3-deck format becomes effectively a 2-deck format. And so even though we see each of those 3 decks popping up over and over again, if you think that rock, paper, scissors formulation of A beats B, B beats C, C beats A if A doesn't actually beat B, or if, it's slightly favored against B, but C is massively favored against A, to the point where the main incentive to play one of these decks falls away, that's when, that part of the format changes, and then maybe some new contender gets to enter the ring instead. Do you see that happening here, or are those 3 decks roughly in some kind of, food chain situation?
I think if any of them is going to fall away for a bit, it's going to be Hammer. So Hammer, I think, follows a trend similar to... I'm trying to think of the last example of this, but it is a highly intricate combo deck, and the people who have played a lot of it are putting up results. And a lot of that is their skill carrying them. And I don't think it's the case with Hammer yet, but I think it's very possible that we can reach a point in the metagame where, like, I think all that really needs to happen is that Force of Vigor needs to show back up in a deck that is good against Shadow and 4-color. I think that one of the things that has prevented this from breaking up is that Shadow is really good against the like Yawgmoths and Amulets of the world that have previously been the Force of Vigor decks. Let's just, as the 2 decks that have like historically been the no bad matchup or no good matchup, where do you put the Shadow Amulet before I start going down this rant? Like, where does that heads up fall?
It is really tough for Amulet, and I think that's why that brief Amulet resurgence that got so many of our hopes up really came to an end, coinciding with Soulstrong's just insane tear through the challenges a while ago. And I don't know how fixable that really is. I think the most plausible plan that I've found at the moment is if you think back to when the go-to plan for like Amulet Bloom against John was just to board out your amulets and to turn into a ram deck instead of a control deck, I think it might be worth trying that again here, because firstly, if you're boarding in a bunch of cards, then something has to come out, and you can't really shave too many lands, and your less conditional ramp pieces are more important there. But also, the Shadow deck has so much good disruption, both discard and removal, and also dress down to stymie your combo turns, that it is really hard for you to put together a big turn with Amulet where you properly go off. And so you're left with this thing that takes up space, is only really conditionally good on like specific turns, and then also walks into your own engineered explosives, which is one of the better cards that you can bring to the matchup. So maybe you can kind of like shift your deck around philosophically, but like game 1 is still going to be tough, and it just is fundamentally hard to address that issue, I think.
Okay, you did answer the question I had in there, which is like the traditional issue of Amulet against Jund was that it was a card they could trade with Decay or Pulse, and Shadow doesn't really do that as well. But it sounds like the issue is literally just like, you got to kill their stuff and something's got to give. So back to the original point, because the Force of Vigor decks aren't really in the metagame in a deep way, it feels really hard for Hammer to be chased out by something that would pop out and do that. Like, you can try to get margin, and like, I think this is where like the you will see the like, 60th percentile Hammer players lose matches and be like, I don't know, I got to work on this matchup. And like, there's like the 85th, 90th percentile Hammer players just like still being 54% against the removal decks. I think that it's really hard to make an argument that like Hammer is really, really great against some of the removal decks, but like, it's not losing a ton of ground. Like, if your opponent's going with Unholy Heat as their answer as opposed to Force of Vigor, I don't think you lose that much ground. I think really where the Hammer deck loses ground is when your opponent is like going to win the game on turn 4 and also has Force of Vigor.
So a more optimistic take on that situation might be that within the label of Hammer, as you went into in your article, you have basically every other color being a plausible splash here, and they all offer different things. And these lists have different strengths and weaknesses, both in the mirror and then in the format at large. And so these broad assumptions about, well, Hammer's good against this, but is weak against this, how sensitive is that to, well, I'm talking about the white splash instead of the green splash or the blue splash, or we actually saw the red splash for Ragavan get 9th in one of the challenges here. You have the Lurus versus non-Lurus split, which the non-Lurus side is mostly just Crusherbot flying that flag on their own, but maybe other people could pick that up too. So how useful do you think it is to make these broad statements about Hammer, or do you have to get quite granular with it in the end?
I think the only one that is they're fairly granular. They're like, it's not, or let's rephrase, they're fairly like small enough impact that I don't think it significantly impacts you playing against it more than like impacting the Hammer players trying to get the last like 3%. With the exception of, I think the Crusher Bot version is a completely different animal against a lot of decks. But as I cited in that article, I think the big issue with that Crusher Bot deck is it is really bad in the Hammer mirrors to not be a Lurrus deck after sideboarding. Just because like people are just going to trade off Cathar Commandos for stuff and then recast their Cathar Commando, and then you're going to lose the game because you can't. So I would, if Hammer dies down, I think you need to make a distinction of like, am I playing against the Lurrus or Nettlecyst version of the deck? But until that happens and there's more room for that deck to breathe, I don't think you need to worry about the distinction between them too much unless you're figuring out which version you're min-maxing for.
Yeah, I think this might be one of those self-regulating things that prevents people from really getting too adventurous here, where almost by definition, any change you can make to target one of the other two decks leaves you weaker in the mirror. So with the 4-color decks, for example, you could play more removal for Hammer. You can play more, I guess, other removal, and then stuff like Veil of Summer, Sanctifier on Vec for Shadow. But then, how do you win the arms race in the mirror? If you have more removal and your opponent is maybe weaker against the format at large, and that might be frustrating to witness from a deck building standpoint, but they're sure as hell going to be better against you because even if their build is maybe a week outdated in one sense.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess we've talked a bit about Hammer. Like, how do we think, what would make Shadow leave the metagame or drop down? Is there something that you think would make these lists worse?
So that one's tricky for me because I think that Shadow almost epitomizes the trends that the format has gone down with MH2. So we're playing all of the good new 1-drops. All of our cards are both very modal and very efficient at the same time, and so they do a bunch of different things. And the deck doesn't really have a clear weakness to exploit in that sense. And so I don't think this is a case of some new printing would lead you in another direction with this shell, unless it's, MH3 is around the corner and there's some strong enough card there that really boosts John Saga specifically, as opposed to Grixis, for example. But that's a very hypothetical case. I think that just this basic idea is where you get to eventually once you keep iterating on that shell. And so I think it's less a case of there are reasons to play something else as opposed to some new deck pops up that happens to line up very well against Shadow. And I don't know exactly what that would look like.
Chalice of the Void? That's what I got.
Yeah. So Chalice is the natural move against Shadow, and I think it can be good against Hammer, but that one's a bit more hit or miss. So, for example, you can take your Eldrazi deck with Chalice of the Void, and yeah, that's probably going to be good against Shadow, and the Chalices sometimes are going to be good against Hammer, but the rest of your deck probably is not going to be. And then against the 4-color decks, well, even to the extent that your Chalice is good, it has this big prismatic ending issue. And then the rest of the 4-color decks are able to prey on any kind of slower Chalice deck. So it's another case, I think, of a deck almost being bailed out by its own rival, because anything that could hard target it is just going to get preyed on by this thing at the other end of the spectrum.
Okay. And then what do you think would drive the 4-color decks out, aside from Goblin Sharp Belcher?
Although, actually, quick revision to the Shadow statement. I think the thing that could be like a short-term exploit for that is something like Dredge, is if either Dredge specifically gets a big boost, or some strategy which is either hyper redundant and so isn't really that weak to disruption, or it just goes outside the bounds of conventional Magic. So Dredge would fall into that, or if there was some very hyper redundant but also fast ramp deck or big mana deck, then I could see that potentially. But it would have to be something which was abnormal and which itself, as a linear deck, could be exploited in various ways.
Okay, I think that's all fair. I think that we have clear-cut answers for what beats Shadow and what beats the Hammer decks. 4-color is tricky to me because It feels like the kind of thing where like the deck shouldn't beat a lot of things, and yet it's still just like sitting at the top of the metagame because the things that it shouldn't beat aren't showing up in any capacity.
Yeah, I think that's maybe how you have to attack Four Color, is to acknowledge the fact that it can, in theory, handle everything, but maybe that results in it being stretched a bit thin. And so if your deck is so fast and puts so much pressure on one axis that you force them to have, one of their solitudes in their 80 card deck within the first few turns, you can just jam on that axis and be good enough a lot of the time. Or conversely, if your deck is good against like Solitude, Fury, Prismatic Ending, well, at that point they don't have that many relevant cards left in their deck, and you can push on that weakness instead. So I think that's almost the response that you have to make, because if you try and outgrind them, that's just not going to work. I just don't think that's really a tenable strategy. So it's almost, you have to pick a lane and just drive down it as fast as possible without really looking behind you.
This really sounds like we're promoting, so we've promoted Force of Vigor, we've promoted Chalice of the Void, we've promoted weirdo linear decks, and we've promoted being an old-fashioned linear again in another way. Are we talking about Eldrazi Tron?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess if you are one of these people who has consistent Tron with that deck without even trying, maybe you can go toe-to-toe with Four Color, but I'm just not seeing how, Thought-Knot Seer, Reality Smasher line up at all well against Solitude and the other, 76 cards in the deck for the most part.
I've actually had better experience with those cards against Solitude than you would think. Just because you tend to come out a little bit ahead of them and they're forced to Solitude in like the negative card advantage way, and then you just play the next threat. But maybe that was more the red version of the deck as opposed to the Tron deck. But it does sound like we're saying that like the metagame is very stagnant at the top, but there's room for something like completely weird to blindside it, the way Belcher did back in the Azorius days.
Yeah, the other thing you can do against Four Color is, because they don't really do anything, if you can find some kind of endgame that just erases all of the incremental advantages that they've accrued over the previous turns, ideally one that they can't just counterspell out of the way, then you can build your whole game plan around that. And it might be the same kind of thing where, like, back in Standard, you had 5-color versus fairies or whatever, and you could play stuff like Crawl Automation, which was on the surface very bad against fairies, but the theory was that would subsidize all of the other stuff in your deck that would hopefully bail you out against fairies. And so likewise, if you have some plan in mind, whether it's like Emrakul the Promised End is one we've seen a fair amount, mostly out of the 4-color decks to target each other, or like Cavern of Souls into maybe Primeval Titan, or just some like really big thing that does something. Out of actual Tron, like Ulamog the Caesar's Hunger is kind of in that space. If you can do that, and then that gives you the latitude to just load up on good cards against Hammer and 4-color, then maybe that's an approach you can take. So, we saw Bring to Light Scapeshift kind of sneaking back in a little bit, and maybe that's what that deck is trying to do, is if you go over the top of 4-color, and the stuff that lets you do that is also pretty good against Shadow, and then Hammer's an issue because your deck is so inefficient, but maybe that's where a pile of explosives and Force of Figures and so on can flip that for you too.
I like that idea. I think that the Indomitable Creativity deck probably can operate in a similar space where you're sort of cannibalizing, like the 4-color deck cannibalized the Azorius decks by going bigger, and then you can like recannibalize by going a level up from that.
Yeah, the Creativity deck, I think, has the issue of in the mirrors, or against 4-color rather, then you need the right mix of targets, and it's unclear to me exactly what that is. I guess if you get a pair of Serra's Emissaries, then on like Creature and Planeswalker, then that's pretty hard to deal with for the most part. But you need the right mix of payoffs there. And then against Shadow, I think you do lose enough games to just your creativity gets inquisitioned, and then it's hard to actually play a decent control game against them.
Yeah, that matchup does seem problematic for that deck. There's also like your combo deck that like filters through like the stack and a card in your hand that is inquisitionable and a creature on the battlefield, which is not the greatest.
Yeah, I mean, I could see the Primeval Titan version of the Creativity deck. Like, ticking those boxes in terms of good against 4-color and maybe better against Shadow, but then I don't know if that version is actually good against Hammer anymore. And this is the bind that you inevitably find yourself in.
Yeah, I think that's enough talking about like the various archetypes here. We want to take a break and talk a bit more about like what we're doing and some oddball stuff related to the sort of pseudo stagnation of the format.
Yeah, let's do it.
With this break, I'd like to talk to you about Star City Games Premium. For years, StarCityGames.com has been hosting the best Magic the Gathering strategy content on the internet, and Star City Games Premium is a huge part of that. If you want to see great articles from Pro Tour champions, world champions, and many other accomplished players, as that content comes hot off the presses, subscribe to StarCityGames.com Premium. More than that, Star City Games Premium comes with a host of benefits when shopping at StarCityGames.com. Premium members save 5% on Magic the Gathering Seal product, 10% on singles, and 15% on supplies. There's even special benefits on SCG Tour Online event entries to keep an eye out for when those events come around. All that savings and all that content costs just $7.99 a month. For the price of 2 booster packs, you can be on the cutting edge of Magic the Gathering strategy, getting insights from the best in the industry on Star City Games Premium.
Okay, so we are casting around desperately now for any way out of this this situation that we found ourselves in. What have you been eyeing as some off-the-wall solutions here, or just stuff that you've had some fun messing around with?
So what I've kind of done lately, and I think that you can try to come out ahead in the metagame, but I think that this is like a good opportunity to sit down and use playing the metagame for like an actual purpose. And this is kind of why I wanted to bring up this topic. I've been trying to get good at Hammer. Trying is it's a try. That deck is hard. And the other thing I've kind of defaulted to is just going back to good old Yawgmoth, just because I really enjoy that archetype. And I think that if there's a time you want to do that, it's now, because we have said the metagame is sort of stagnant. But like I said, I don't think the margins are that great that it's an absolute embarrassment to play the deck that you like in this metagame right now.
Yeah, I think that the thing that makes it hard to crack the code, where every matchup feels like it's 55-45 in one direction or the other, also does make it easy to stomach that, or at least to have some fun swimming upstream there with your paired deck against the main decks, just because certainly with Hammer, like whatever your deck is, you can identify cards that are good against some aspect of Hammer, and you have to be careful. Like if you just show up with a pile of artifact hate that isn't actually good against the deck, you can get blindsided by just Urza Saga or someone or a skilled Hammer pilot navigating around that. And I think that's like the best decks in Modern in the past. I think it has been more helpful in a way when they are these linear decks that have the obvious counterplay to them. So yeah, it's pretty bad for the format in some ways if Dredge is the best deck, but also it's pretty clear how to beat Dredge if Dredge is the best deck, versus when it is Shadow and 4-color that don't seem to have those obvious weaknesses, then if you actively want to flip those matchups in your favor, then there's not always an obvious way of doing that.
I don't know if it's even true anymore that these decks don't have hate cards, because Veil of Summer and Blood Moon are very, very good.
Yeah, that is one of the things that tempts you from the outside is there a good Blood Moon deck? Because Blood Moon, often very good against Grixis, kind of good by default against 4-color, and then hit or miss against Hammer, but especially on the play, sometimes that will steal its fair share of games there too, and is also just a nice answer to have against Urza Saga. My issue is, I don't know what the good Blood Moon deck is meant to look like necessarily.
I think we've discussed a lot of stuff that like makes me want to build a stupid version of Gruul, but that's probably not the best idea.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we did mention Murktide with Blood Moon a while back, but it feels like the non-Blood Moon aspect of that deck, Hammer has always been the thorn in that deck's side, and then I don't know if you're that good naturally against either Shadow or 4-color, and at that point, what are you hoping to prey on? It's almost like you are consciously signing up for being behind against everything and hoping that this one neat trick is enough to flip that for you.
Yeah, I don't necessarily love a large number. Like, I don't want to main deck Blood Moon. I'm okay with like access to it, but I don't want to main deck it. So I've kind of moved to these like creature combo decks because that's just like my natural place to be in Modern. What have you been dirtling around with lately?
So I haven't been doing all that much dirtling in Modern. I've spread my dirtle tendency to some other formats. I think preparing for some events this weekend online, I'm going to look back at Bring to Light. It feels like something in that space should be doable, which is weird to say because with the 4-color decks, you have basically whatever colors and mana you want at any given time. You could plausibly stretch to the 5th color if you really wanted to. And you have 80 cards to work with. So in theory, the whole format is at your fingertips. And yet, it almost feels like you have less variation in those decks for the most part than you do in Hammer, where you can try on any splash color you want, or no splash color, or no companion for any given weekend. Or I guess Shadow is pretty homogenized at this point. But the 4-color decks, you would almost expect to have more variation within them than they do. But once you are willing to change like 15 cards as opposed to 5 or 6 cards, at that point you have a lot of like vaguely similar decks, which maybe are worth exploring. And I think the Bring to Light deck is kind of there.
How much of that like forced similarity do you think is counting colors for Solitude and Fury?
That's a good question. I think Fury less so. You often see roughly 2 copies of that card is the average I've seen recently, unless you're really going hard on Ephemerate. But I think Solitude is one of the main draws of the deck, and you also do need to make sure that you are supporting that card effectively enough. And so then the question becomes, how many plausible white cards or gold cards that include white are there? And, you know, you have Prismatic Ending, you have Teferi, like that is all kind of priced in. You have the other redundant copies of Solitude, you have Omnath. That gets you to, I guess, 16 plus by itself. So it's not that hard to either leave it there or to find a few to make up the numbers, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, you did just cite like 16 cards that are now just like locked in because those are the 16 cards that you're going to play. I think that might be some of it, but I think that
to be fair, to tie those two strands together, one of the decks I was thinking about trying was 80 card Bring to Light with Solitude and Yorion. So maybe that's you know, I don't know if that's a disproof of the problem or the exact example of what you're talking about there.
Yeah, that is a good question. I guess one thing, we've talked a lot about this like format the way it is. Do we think that like having an end game, like Modern Horizons 2 was released 7 months ago now, going on 8? Is that a bad end game for the format, that like where we've ended up?
I don't think so. And we have had a few sets since then, and in the wake of a set like Modern Horizons or Modern Horizons 2, I think it's really hard to recalibrate your expectations for a new set release in a realistic way. And so, you know, we had Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, which was pretty underwhelming by most standards for constructed formats, but there are a few gems in there. But I think in a modern context, it's easy to just write the whole thing off because it's not Modern Horizons, as opposed to this is, objectively speaking, a below par set in that regard. And so when we get back to a kind of more normal baseline of like Innistrad Midnight Hunt would be a good example, right? Where we have Faithless Looting, which is a really big pickup for the format that brings Reanimator into existence. People try stuff like Phoenix again and so on. And then you have a bunch of like role players like Consider and some other stuff, Memory Deluge. That is about what you can expect from any given set going forward, I think. And so maybe the issue with the concept of Modern Horizons is going to completely turn the format on its head. And then in maybe 6 to 8 months' time, you reach the endpoint of where that gets you. And now, are we just marking time until the next earthquake of an equivalent size? Or do we have to be happy with this, you know, occasional drip feed of new playables as opposed to this massive deluge of new format warping cards all at once?
That's a good question. I think that it's a weirder argument to have also after the fact that Modern Horizons 1 was followed by M20, Throne of Eldraine, Theros Beyond Death, Ikoria, and then like finally we got back to sort of normal sets. I think it's I don't know how much of this discussion is like, I wish we could have had like a Modern Horizon set just pop into existence in like 2017. Yes. I want to know how different things would be then.
Yeah, I almost wonder if the true impact of the first Modern Horizons was obscured by just everything else that was going on around it. Where you could argue War of the Spark really like lit the touch paper there, and then from then it was just War of the Spark, Modern Horizons, and then just going down the list for a solid year and change. And at that point, it's hard to disentangle the impact of any one set from all of the others, whereas now it feels much easier to do that. It feels like, yeah, well, this is because of Modern Horizons 2, and then everything else around it is, is true to form.
Yeah, I also almost wonder the reverse, because I don't think the Modern Horizons 1 cards especially are, aside from, let's see, which ones ended up on the ban list? Hogak and Astrolabe. And I think that's about it. But like,
yeah,
it's hard to tell how much of that was just like these cards had like, one of the highlights of the Modern Horizons cards is they are printed at a different level of like rate and therefore like weaknesses on exchanges, or strength on exchanges in like the world of like Ren and Six and Unholy Heat. And it just becomes like harder for them to get shrugged out of the format. And therefore, when everything else becomes broken around them, in the sense of like Throne of Eldraine, it like just looks like a lot more of them are showing up because of the cards that haven't been ejected. I wonder how much of at least that set's impact on the format is like a bit overstated because of A, those 2 cards, and B, what I just mentioned. Modern Horizons 2, I don't think I can make any of the same arguments for, because the cards from that set are just like wild.
Yeah, if you line up the 2 Modern Horizons sets against each other, I would say the big difference, and tell me if you disagree here, but I think with MH2, you saw both the threats and the answers really pushed to the limits, as opposed to the first set where it felt like you had a lot of big threats, but the answers weren't really boosted up in quite the same way. You had stuff like Force of Negation, Force of Vigor, and so on, but I think MH2 really takes that ball and runs with it. And so the bar for any just new build-around card in a generic set to actually slog through Unholy Heat, Solitude, Fury, so on and so forth, it's just so much higher. And then also, even once you do that, you then have to outcompete the threats in MH2, like the Motide Regents and the Ragavans and Dragon's Rage Channelers and so on. And it's already difficult for a card to clear one of those 2 bars. I think clearing both at the same time is all but impossible. And so when the bar is set that high, there are cards which are like legitimately strong cards, which you're excited to see print in a strong set aimed at, I don't know where now, and maybe that's a conversation worth having, but those cards might just still fall flat because why would they? Like the competition here is so tough.
I think we'll call those cards aimed at Pioneer and just say that that's good. New Magic cards are officially aimed at Pioneer or Modern. That's fine. Yeah, it is. That is a good question. So I guess one of the topics we keep coming back to is like, has MH2 been a good idea? And like, this is not the first time we've talked about it. It's interesting to discuss this where like on a macro level, it has, how much worse is it to have new cards break into the format now as opposed to in 2016? And I don't feel like the bar has been raised, but I don't think like the rate of cards appearing has necessarily changed too much. In like on an individual card level, like Modern Horizons 2 has like largely been good. I don't know. This is something that I always keep mulling over. I don't have a good answer yet even.
Yeah, the other thing as well that strikes me is that for the MH1, you have 2 clear ban-worthy cards at the very least in Hogak and Arkham's Astrolabe, and even though Astrolabe lasted a lot longer than it probably should have. And then you have maybe some implied effects of like, do we lose Mox Opal if Urza had never entered the picture, stuff like that. With MH2, I don't think, even after 7 or 8 months now, I don't think there's anything that needs to be banned, and that can only really be counted as a resounding success. That being said, I think there's a lot of stuff which doesn't quite meet that bar for being banned necessarily, but it still exerts a throttling effect on the format at large. And so, that unholy trinity of Chandler, Ragavan, and Unholy Heat, despite the initial chatter, I don't think any of those cards need to be banned. But then in concert, I think they really limit the scope of what you can do in the format. And so do you have to hit one of them eventually? And then which one do you aim at? Or stuff like Murktide region, our preview card, our baby, I think is one of the more quietly egregious offenders here, as odd as that is to say. So maybe that's almost a worse scenario in one sense, where like there isn't one thing that you can say, if I woke up and this was gone tomorrow, then the solution, then, this issue would be solved and the format would look a lot different. You would either have to ban, a dozen cards at once, or hope that some new game changer came along to upend all of that.
Yeah, well, so on the flip side of that, do you think that, we just went through this whole ban list discussion and we went through and came up with like 3 to 5 cards we thought would be reasonable to unban? Do you think that any of those things that were reasonable are things that would actually like cause would like unbanning Preordain or something like that cause enough of a shakeup to the format more than just like waiting for a new printing than a normal set that's like good for the format, like another expressive iteration style card? Like, I don't actually think the answer is yes.
So I think that you would have to look at this current context and then look at the ban list in light of that. So yeah, you could unban Preordain, but I think the more likely effect of doing that would be, Shadow slots that in and gets better, so does Murktide, maybe even 4-color finds room for this too. I think the rich getting richer, so to speak, is maybe one of the things you have to worry about alongside just what if this card itself is hideously broken. So a card like, Dark Depth, for example, there is a chance that unbanning that just proves to be a gigantic mistake, and for the time that it's legal, no one actually has fun playing with or against it. But because it doesn't slot cleanly into any of the existing decks, you can at least guarantee that if it is good, well, this is a new thing, a new dynamic that has entered the format, and maybe that's something which they would prioritize a little bit more.
This is like the novelty of like putting your hand on a hot stove. It's like, that's new. I don't like that.
Just like a warm, soothing serve, I think is what we're aiming for here.
Yeah, definitely more of like a hot tub than a nice boiling pot. I really like, we have like delved a little bit into topics that are like, make it sound like the format is iffy. I really think the format is in a great place and like, you should enjoy it for what it is. I just think that the like week to week hustle that we've gone through over the last few months is going to slow down in at least some fashion. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe so one of the things that's also been cited about Modern Horizons 2 is that like to play all these decks, you need to own new Modern Horizons 2 cards. And to play this other deck, you need a bunch of other new cards. And it's just like keeping up with a bunch of new content across an ever-changing, like a rapidly changing metagame is kind of painful in, for a format that is supposed to be, 20 years of cards. I think that maybe this format stabilizing is like one of the best things that could happen to it in terms of like getting people to like settle in and be like, okay, I'm going to like, it's like one of the old things in Modern was you could start with one deck and work your way from one deck to 2 decks and like take time to do it. I think that is something that was lost over the last couple of years, that I think that this kind of stability really is important to bring back.
Yeah, I think that within the last year as well, we have had formats that grew more stale a lot more quickly than this. So you think back to February, March of 2021, just in the wake of the big hard reset of the format, that turned into Heliod versus Praris for a month or two, and then Praris versus Heliod for a month or two after that. And had any of those formats lasted for another 6 or 8 months, if we hadn't had a Modern Horizon set, I think people would be clamoring for something big to change, frankly. And like, what would that even look like in that context? Is it banning expressive iteration or something? Would it be banning Heliod? Or like, it sounds almost more absurd than any of the things that people are suggesting now, where, I think this snapshot of Modern is pretty good compared to where the format has been several times over the past year. And I think we should be thankful for that at the very least. I think one change that is plausible, and this is the drumbeat that you see a lot in just general Modern discussion on the internet these days, is the prevalence of companions. So the one thread that unites these very different 3 decks at the center of the format is they all center around their companions, right? 4-color necessarily has to be built differently with Yorion in mind, and then has that as its endgame. Hammer, unless you are exactly Crusherbot. Lurrus is a a free roll essentially and a massive part of that deck. And then for the Grixis decks, I think it is as close to a literal free roll there as it is anywhere else, and also is a big part of that deck's success. And I wonder if the thing that could cause the most churn, where you shake up all of the top tier at once without actually invalidating anyone's investment in any of those decks, and then also kind of lifting this cloud over the format at large and Magic at large, is just either some further nerf to companions or just deleting them from constructed entirely.
Yeah, I go back and forth on this discussion because, like, if you look at these top 8s of these challenges, I just pulled up, I think this is the Sunday one, but I know one of them got called out as, like, was it literally 8 out of 8 companions, one of the challenges? Something
like that. And then when you look at the top 16 on the top 32, you're very consistently getting stuff like 23 out of 32 are companion decks, or 11 out of 16 in the top 16. And when you remove the decks which just trivially could not support a companion, stuff like the Cascade decks, for example, of the decks which, could make tweaks to accommodate a companion, they're all doing that. You don't really see anyone who is foregoing that. And so I think the companions, if that had marked this fundamental sea change in Magic, where we expect in a few years' time there are going to be 30 different companions, and we expect basically all constructed decks to have one in some capacity, I think people could accommodate that over time. And if companions had never existed, I think that's a world a lot of people want to live in. And instead, we've ended up in this weird in-between where there are only the initial companions, only a handful of those are actually any good in the first place. And when you reach a decision of, should I try and play these in my deck or not, the answer basically always is yes. And so it's tough to identify where the interesting decisions are there. And then inherently, the companion mechanic is repetitive. And we've had going on 2 years of that repetition at this point, and that shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon.
You're not going to find me arguing against just like fundamentally removing the companion mechanic from the game, because it's a dumb idea. I'm not even going to mince words on this one. It was a dumb idea. Every time that someone has done this in a game, it has basically always ended up bad. I think I have seen like exactly one good implementation of it ever, and that involved like extra balancing steps where like you're like, it's basically like Vanguard, where like you are modifying like all sorts of other aspects of the game around balancing for it, and also everyone is playing it. I just like, I don't think the idea of printing more is a good idea, but my counter argument is that like when you play a match of like not companion versus a companion deck, is that companion really like driving what's going on in the game? Is it the dominant factor? Like, I mean, maybe it's the kind of thing where like maybe their impact is like, it doesn't feel like a blatant slap in the face most of the time to play against companion, unless you are like it feels like mostly in the mirrors is where it comes up, where like you're very deliberately taking a stance where like they just have a specific extra card in a game that's supposed to be at parity.
Yeah, I guess the analogy I would make is it feels like you're running a race against someone and you expect that person, maybe they're faster than you, maybe they have more stamina than you, whatever, but at least you are running the same race, as opposed to they just get a 100-meter head start on you and you're left trying to make that up the entire time. And so when you look at the decks which there's no real decision, right? So Grixis Shadow, you're playing Lurrus, and I'm not even sure what the card that you might want to plausibly cart Lurrus for is in that strategy. Then it's just like, okay, I can fight them toe-to-toe, I can slug through all of the stuff that they have going on, just a very fundamentally solid deck. And then the second wave of that is just there for free by default because Lurrus is looming over the proceedings here. Or against Hammer, for example, you actually do have this divide between the non-Lurrus versions and the Lurrus versions. And I think the non-Lurrus versions are more interesting from a gameplay standpoint, insofar as like you have the Nettlecyst is a card which is like clunky-ish, but then very rewarding if you get to connect the dots with it. Same thing with any of the various swords, whichever ones Crusher Bot is playing these days. And you can plausibly, line up your removal the right way and actually run them out of cards versus, well, I've done that, and now here's Lurrus just to, maybe go through all of that again. And then, the Yorion decks, it is basically impossible for them to get ground down on resources because you have a gigantic Mole Drifter just on tap for free. I don't know. It seems like if you want the format to change in some way, then I guess new printings can do that. But again, what do those look like in the context of a normal release versus this one change which takes all of the top decks down a peg at the same time and then opens up some more space on the margins too?
I want to throw one more wrench in this because,
okay,
like I said, on a fundamental level, I would love if the companions were unexisted. But I don't know if the London Mole era of Modern is made significantly better by being able to plan ahead for what your opponent has revealed. I think that knowing in advance whether you need your hand to beat, I don't think like most decks, like whether you're playing against Grixis or like Hammer, actually, like when your opponent reveals a Luris, broadly, a lot of the same things apply. It's really weird where like you would think that it like pushes you down one road or the other in terms of mulligans, but it almost doesn't because it's just like Ragavan has a similar set of constraints to beating Hammer a lot of the time. And then like when your opponent reveals a Yorion or Kahira, you kind of know what to expect. And then when they don't reveal a companion, you also know that they're like up to some nonsense. And I think that even though I've praised the ubiquity of like the removal spells can hit whatever, and like that's great, but like there are still like quantity factors of removal and like whether you want to take an aggressive position, like things like that, just like from turn one that are decided by your opponent's companion reveal. And I think that Modern is, I think open deck lists are the wrong way to approach it, but it would do good from like some kind of middle ground where like you aren't just like, oh, I kept lightning bolts, Ren and 6, something, and my opponent went Goblin Charbelcher. That was dumb. Like the amount of times that happens and you feel like you could have done something in game one, I don't think that should be a prominent feature of the format. It should be a small feature, but I think that the companions reducing that feature of the format is an upside that is worth considering.
That's fair enough. And I don't want to be in here giving the same periodic rant about companions every so often, just beating that dead horse firmly into the ground. On the other side of things, what do you think could be added into the format in terms of new cards that would rejuvenate things or maybe break up this existing paradigm?
Like I think that Faithful Mending was an interesting case study. I don't have an exact design in mind, but I think that you want to there's like this nice window of like rate, but also like subsidized other effects that is what you want to see pushed, where like the gain 2 life and instant speed on Mending actually created a lot of interesting semi-reactive decks that like you wouldn't expect. And I think that you can like the I don't want to say Kolagon's command because that card has aged a little poorly on rate. But like I guess Prismari Command is also another great example. I think that what you want to look for is like cards where you are sort of subsidizing an effect that would be put like you're preventing the worst case scenario from happening, finding the exact right spot to put the rate, but then also subsidizing other effects that allow whatever archetype you're creating to like just like play a little more of a normal game against the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that cards which are flexible while requiring a specific context of what we're going for here, because what you don't want to happen is some generically good value engine pops up and just gets like seamlessly absorbed into the 4-color decks. And now they just get even stronger without even trying. So I guess maybe this suggests just stuff that isn't in the Omnath colors, like good black cards would be a good step in this direction. Or, we have a gold set, Streets of New Capenna, scheduled for 2022. Maybe just like good 3-color cards, which if you're playing this, then there are sacrifices in terms of your mana base. If there is like a version of like Sprouting Thrynax at the same mana cost, which is price to move for Modern, you can't really play that in the same deck as Urza Saga, for example. So you make these sacrifices where you can. I think stuff like that is kind of where we need to be, and that's at a very abstract level, but just having some kind of requirements, but also good incentives attached to them is, I think, the sweet spot there.
Yeah, your point about printing good black cards is certainly noted. Even though Shadow is one of the best decks, the color black in Modern still has a lot of the issues we talked about a few months ago, where like it kind of exists in a narrow space of like Thoughtseize is okay, and like the big incentive is like you get to play Luris with the mana that you make for it, and like the Shadow decks have like some black cards, but like I don't know. I think that it would be nice to have more black cards that are playable in the format, really. And then you mentioned the 3-color stuff. There's 2 things going on with Streets of New Capenna that I'm interested in on that aspect. One is that I believe it's a Shard versus Wedge. It's the one that's not going to have Triomes. If the set has Triomes, I'm just going to be sad about this. But going against the Triomes in terms of like how you're positioning your mana there, I think is kind of important. But then also we mentioned good black cards. It's just like 3 of the 5 3-color trios that you can draw will have black cards.
Yeah, I think historically the like Shard / Wedge sets have led to standard format sort of, I guess Ikoria is like a wrench in there, but I think people do enjoy that kind of gameplay where it's like, this is a 3-color deck over here versus a completely different 3-color deck over here. Both of them have the flagship cards, their color combination, and now we're just battering those against each other. So, you know, the Abzan versus Jeskai stuff didn't really grow old for people in that standard the way that I thought it would past a certain point.
Yeah, I think that Ikoria just kind of failed because like I'm not even remember what the name of the stupid wedges and that shit are. Like the Abzan card or whatever, you know, like your Abzan card is like weirdo mutate dies trigger card, and you're just like, where's my Siege Rhino? Why is this not a 4-mana 4/5? And it's like, but it returns 10 power of things from your graveyard if you put it on a non-human. And you're like, what if I just drained 3 life? I would like that. Like, give me just a deal.
It felt like the 3-color identity in that set was like the triome of that wedge and the ultimatum of that wedge, and really nothing distinct in between.
Yeah, it made for a great draft set, but not really. The constructed parts of that did not bleed through.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts on this then before we get into nonsense of the week?
No, I think that like I keep trying to allude to is that I think Modern is in a good place, and the important thing is like figuring out how you want to enjoy like a stagnant but broad Modern format is important, as opposed to just like viewing it as just like this new thing funnel that's occurring. You know, you don't have to like learn this week about Goblin Charbelcher and learn next week about like all this info about recross the past stacks that you learned is not necessarily as new and fresh as like Grixis Death Shadow life totals. Just like find something and get good at it.
Yeah, we have found topics to talk about every week in here and write about, usually in our respective columns for, you know, going on 7 months now, and we're not really running out of ideas. So in that sense, this format has had a lot of longevity to it, and even though we have a lot of specific complaints, the format at large, I think we're both still enjoying quite a bit. But I do hope that when we get to, you know, episode 50, let's say, we have some new and fresh topics to dive into.
Again, pioneer, I'm telling you, it's the future.
Hey, I mean, if we can persuade Cedric to let us do like a pioneer episode every now and then, I'm more than in for that. But in the meantime, we will take a short break and come back with our nonsense of the week.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' very own Cube podcast, where every week myself and Justin Parnell will be tackling topics regarding all things Cube Draft. We're talking set reviews, digital Cube retrospectives, archetype breakdowns, tons of tips on both how to design your own cube as well as play other people's cubes, with plenty of nonsense interspersed. If you're into Cube Draft, we would love it if you gave us a listen, and if you're not, maybe we can fix that. Check out the 540 every week right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, let's close out this episode then with a smattering of nonsense from across the past fortnight here. And maybe it's just, the holiday season. Maybe it is the fact that the format is shrinking a little bit, but we had to go pretty deep within 2 weeks of league results to find some good candidates here.
Yeah, I do like this first one, especially because we joked about other formats. It looks like someone just registered their, I guess, historic deck in this format.
Yeah, so this is John Food, which at various points has been the best deck in standard and then 5 different iterations of historic, like every other time, and then in between it's some hideously broken combo deck, and then also Pioneer on and off at certain points too. So I guess it was only a matter of time before it showed up here in Modern. And this is not the Asmo cookbook stuff that was all the rage in the early weeks of Modern Horizons 2. This is John Food. This is Mayhem Devil and Cat Oven and Deadly Dispute and Ravenous Scroll, which was the card that really made me want to feature this deck, because there was a Twitter thread recently asking people, which MH2 card do you think is, not getting the attention it deserves? My answer was Ravenous Scroll. I think that card is pretty messed up on rate. It's an amazingly flexible 1-drop that balloons out of control once you have your engine pieces together, while also being this engine piece in its own right. But there's just not really an obvious home for it. And so I salute the attempt to try and find one here.
Yeah, thinking about this card, I think the hybrid cost is what throws people, because they're like, oh, it has to be a black or a green card. But I'd also like to remind people that, like, there was excitement about Willowgeist when it got printed, and Ravenous Squirrel feels like it is a more flexible version of the same kind of, even though the trigger's different, it's like the same degree of nonsense you're pushing.
I almost wonder, and this might be giving people too little credit, I wonder if people just forgot the card exists, because I still to this day will find cards from MH1 that I just have never seen before, and it's like, oh wow, I didn't know that was a card, but tell me more. Just because there's so much else going on that some stuff falls through the cracks there. So I'm excited to see if someone does find a home for Squirrel. The other card here, which I want to touch on quickly, is Deadly Dispute. I've heard this described as the Black Expressive iteration, and this is a card which has been impressing more and more in Standard, Alchemy, Historic, Pioneer, basically every format smaller than this one. And in the Modern card pool, there are so many good ways to set that up, whether it's Chromatic Star in these artifact-heavy decks, or Blood Fountain I looked at when that card was previewed. It feels like that card, again, once the right home is found for it, that won't really come as a surprise.
Yeah, I do want to point out that this card has been kind of tearing it up in Pauper. It's kind of hard because the artifact lands don't exist in Modern, but like the Affinity deck in Pauper is just a 4 Deadly Dispute deck where you're just like, I will sacrifice my Chromatic Star that I was already playing to make an artifact and also draw 2 cards, but like this can also sacrifice a land. I think that there might be something along those same lines to do in Modern.
Yeah, I guess finally I'll touch on Mayhem Devil quickly, which no surprise to see that card showing up in the shell, but the potential of that card in a format with fetch lands, not just your own, but also your opponent's, because easy to forget until the trigger just appears on the stack out of nowhere that also does trigger on your opponent's stuff too. So a good card in this deck naturally, and also just a weird accidental hate card against a lot of decks as well.
Yeah, I think that this is a card that actually is benefited by Modern Horizons 2, specifically because the difference between something that dies to lightning, like there's no longer this line drawn at lightning bolt kills your creature, which was really the issue for Mayhem Devil when it was printed, was like, you can't do that in Modern because it dies to lightning bolt. Now everything dies to Unholy Heat, so it's just as bad as everything else.
Yeah, this gets solituded just like literally every other creature in the format does, so who really cares, ultimately? Let's move on to something quite different here. This is a 4-color Bring to Light Valky kind of control deck, which I think has big Charlie the Banana King energy. He's not the one playing it. This is by Bubsy, is the screen name, but I think if you showed Charlie this deck, they would have good things to say about it.
Yeah, they would add 4 Urza Saga too.
And some white cards, some Solitudes maybe.
Yeah, I don't know where I fall in terms of this is like a classic aspiring Spike style thing too, where like the Luris setup is involved. Like I have a 5-drop, but also Luris. I do like the aspect that this also turns into like a Turok dress down deck out of the sideboard. You don't have to be a Death Shadow deck to use some of the best parts of the Death Shadow deck.
And to tie back into our earlier theme, this is also a Luris deck, because the gimmick here is your threats are Snapcaster Mage and Ren and 6, both of which are pretty good candidates to bring back with Luris. And then the big endgame tactic is Bring to Light 4 Valky, but the thing that lets you Bring to Light 4 Valky / Chibalt in the first place is the front side in Valky has a mana value of 2, and so you can have that be eligible for Luris in your deck, and then also Bring to Light finds your 2-drop, which then smuggles itself into play as a 7-drop.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I think that actually casting Valky has not aged super well, but maybe Tybalt has. I haven't cast Tybalt in a while.
Tybalt is very, very good, I think. But the existing Bring to Light decks, I'm going to do my best to see if the Dryad Bring to Light stuff is still good. But just fair Bring to Light, no Scape Shift, none of that stuff. Just Bring to Light for Tybalt. I think that is still a pretty good finisher if you have the right supporting cast for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is it better than, I guess Scape Shift takes up a bunch of cards, so we can talk about something else then.
Yeah, I don't know if, maybe Charlie could put Valakut in this mana base and be happy with it, but I don't think anyone else could.
Yeah, that would be a little sketchy. I mean, you could have a lot of Triomes.
I mean, I'm always down to have some more Triomes, but we're stretching things a little thin at that point. We'll finish this out here with not one, but two takes on, I guess one is 4-color and the other is 5-color elementals with Yorion this time, not Gahira. And one of these is from Canister, who was, has a certain fondness for Risen Reef and was largely responsible for putting that deck on the map in the first place, going back to his roots here. The other is from Cobra Massa, who is going the full 5 colors with 4 Endurance, 4 Grief, 4 Solitude, 4 Fury, 4 Solitude. We have the full 20-pack of pitch elementals from MH2 here. So a hefty blow to your wallet if you're trying to build this deck on really any platform. And then also the first time that achievement has officially been unlocked, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. I think the 4 Horde of Notions is carrying a lot of weight.
Oh, yeah.
The Prophetic Prisms are kind of funny to me because it's almost better fixing than Prophetic Prism to have a 5-color card in your deck just so you can pitch it.
Right, I guess we have this whole Triome, Cavern of Souls, Reflecting Pool setup, which you can just about fudge to make it work.
Fudge is certainly the right word there.
Yeah, this is, I guess I admire the commitment to the bit that is on display here from Cobra Massa.
Yeah, there is a card in the Canister list that I do want to bring up in these discussions of Bring to Light decks. Is Bringing to Light for Titania a worthy thing to do?
So I want it to be true, and it seems like it should be. I think that's one of the more obvious things to do with Titania. I think it's tough when, so often it's going to get trumped immediately by, Solitude, Unholy Heat or something before you can really do anything impressive with it. And sometimes you set it up so that you have a fetch land kind of in reserve, and so you get at least one 5/3 out of the equation. But just one 5/3 is really not getting the job done against basically anyone. So I kind of like it as a tactic to work with. And in the Canister list, this is an Eladamri's core target, among other things. Obviously fantastic with Risen Reef as well. But just the idea of, I'm going to cast Titania, that has not made the waves that I hoped it would coming out of the MH2 spoiler season.
Okay, I just wanted to check on that because I have not been in the ever casting Titania camp so far. And I hadn't really thought about the issue where all the removal catches it instant speed in response to the return trigger. So, okay. Worth a shot.
One card also in the Canister list to touch on is Oath of Nissa, which is a bit hit or miss in the regular 4-color Blink decks. But in this deck, where you have all of the elementals and Risen Reef, and you still have Teferi Time Raveler here as good things to hit, you can just about get away with. You got your Ephemerates, your prismatic endings, and so on, but you still have enough hits for Oath of Nissa to be good reliably. And then, of course, once you work towards Yorion, this is basically the perfect thing that you could hope to blink with that card.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting to see that instead of it plus a mix of Abundant Growth here, just because that's the stock one and drawing multiples of that card is not a bad thing. But I guess Oath is more hitting the actual card once you have Risen Reef in your the actual creature that's going to trigger your Risen Reef is the more important part at that point.
Yeah, so I think the verdict was mixed from Canister on this version. I think that he wasn't actually that sure that this could outgrind the 4-color decks reliably or the shadow decks as reliably. But if you are a fan of elementals, if you have your Risen Reefs and so on gathering dust, then maybe worth revisiting this shell with a little more padding in it this time.
Yeah, Risen Reef is just a good enough card that I think the thing about Canister's list that's worth highlighting is that, I guess he has 4 Voice of Resurgence, which negates what I'm about to say, but you can put Risen Reef in your deck without a lot of bad elementals and have it be good.
Yeah, this is the 5-0 list, the one that got published. I'm pretty sure for the next league, that was just a 4-1, but Voice of Resurgence quickly disappeared from that version of the deck.
Good.
So with that in mind, I think that does it for our Nonsense of the Week and also for our episode. So you can find me on Twitter at Dominaria. You can find Ari on Twitter at ARMLX. You can find both of us, hopefully, back here next week and then every week on StarCityGames.com. But until then, we'll talk to all of you again soon. Take care, everyone.